right now we're in the middle of, I think, kind of a cope cycle when it comes to the Nintendo Switch 2 and how it's being received. Because it's pretty self evident if you actually go out and talk to people who play games that everyone's really excited for this thing, right? People are eagerly anticipating its release. People are looking forward to games like Silk Song. They're looking forward to games like Mario Kart World, like Street Fighter 6 on Nintendo Switch, like Donkey Kong Bonanza. There's just this is clearly going to do really well day one, and yet we still have this like really awkward like kind of refusal from the community to kind of admit it. And you're seeing all sorts of weird copes, by the way. Like if you look at like analysts and how they're like acting about this. They're trying to say like all this really weird stuff that doesn't really mesh with reality at all. Like this idea that Mario Kart isn't a system seller, or that like no one's going to buy the Switch 2 for old ports, or that like the GameCube NSO isn't going to be a big deal. Like there's all these things that are very clearly going to implode probably day one. I don't think there's really any disputing this anymore. Like Nintendo is by far on top of the console space. Like that's just the reality of what we're seeing here is that Nintendo essentially has monopolized gaming, and yet there's still this like very stubborn refusal from millennials to admit it, because these are the guys who like grew up being told that like Nintendo was going bankrupt, or that like they were gonna go third party, right? That PlayStation and Xbox were way more popular, and that was really never true if you really think about it. One of the examples I go to a lot is the PlayStation, right? The narrative back then was that like, oh, you go to PlayStation for the RPGs, but Nintendo had Pokemon, and it was bigger than like any other RPG on the market. Like, but like it was written off and ignored and treated as its own thing, while people like worshipped Final Fantasy VII and put it on a pedestal that it really, to a certain extent, did not really deserve. Like there were better games on Nintendo 64 and Game Boy that were way better than the PlayStation. Nintendo made more money than PlayStation during that period. And this is something that people who gush about console sales and software sales don't really understand, is that the hardware and software sales for PlayStation are fake, and Nintendo made more money in spite of the commonly touted claims that PlayStation was far more popular. Like it's very important that we understand this, that we like kind of talk about this going forward, because the narrative back then was that PlayStation was way more popular among normies, like the average cool gamer that goes out at night, and only like children cared about Nintendo, right? And now that that's like observably not true, like 20 years later, like the narrative has kind of shifted, where people are like doing this, pulling these stunts where they're just like, well, kids today are playing Minecraft. They're playing Roblox. They're not playing Nintendo games. Their parents are picking Nintendo games out for them if they play them at all. And I'm just like, yeah. Like, who do you think? Like, what kind of cope is that? Like, oh, like kids will play other games on Nintendo hardware other than Nintendo games. It's just such an insane cope. It's gonna be result in the same thing that happened when I was a kid, right? Where I grew up playing like all these different games from all these different companies. I had a gaming PC, I had like all this stuff, and then like I leaned towards Nintendo stuff because I realized it was better and I liked it more. Like recently I had this experience with Yu-Gi-Oh, right? Where like I got into trading cards because I wanted to play Yu-Gi-Oh again, and then I slowly realized that like in a lot of ways the Pokemon TCG is better. And that's not something that like you're really supposed to talk about or address. In fact, I think the Pokemon TCG is kind of looked down on in the world of trading card games, but it does need to be said that Nintendo is that this is something that's happened to me several times. Like the age old cope of acting like, like, oh, there's nothing for me to play on Nintendo consoles. They don't make games for the serious gamer. It's just nothing but a cope from people who really don't know anything about the company to begin with. And I've been saying this for years, but I think it's becoming very, very evident. Like we're at the point now where like millennials are aging, and all of their old copes are just kind of falling by the wayside. Like one of the ones I grew up with. The idea that like New Super Mario Bros. Is basic. It completely fell apart. Like people demonized the art style to those games. They created this like narrative that Nintendo was afraid of innovation and change. And what happens? They put out Mario Wonder. They put out Odyssey. They put out like Donkey Kong Bonanza. Like Brothership. All these games that took like a whole lot of risks with those franchises and characters, and yet like that completely flew against like the established narrative. So all they can do now is like try and pretend like, oh no, like New Super Mario Bros. Was a bad game though. But like when people go back to it and play it and actually experience it for themselves and begin to realize that New Super Mario Bros. Is a great game and absolutely one of the DS's premier titles. So what this means, and what needs to be acknowledged, is that this process is just going to repeat itself. People are going to invent some kind of narrative to throw against Nintendo, to try and demonize them, to try and hate them. And it's just completely going to fall apart. The reality is, like there is fundamentally nothing wrong with Nintendo as a company. All the complaints you see online, all the copes, all the narratives, what it all essentially amounts to is that people are looking for excuses to hate Nintendo hardware. They're looking for they essentially already decided that Nintendo is inferior without really taking the time to really understand the company, its business model, its franchises, and constantly keeps doing this thing where they keep complaining to the point where more and more people are beginning to notice the general pattern. The inability of these individuals to really make a valid criticism of Nintendo. That is the situation we're in right now. Like they absolutely cannot like make any of their narratives stick. And that's a really important thing to take notice of, considering what's happened in the past like 10 years, ever since like, well, 8 years since the release of the Nintendo Switch and the Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. They keep inventing these narratives, like this idea Breath of the Wild is just a Ubisoft game. Like, not true at all, completely dismissed. Nobody says that anymore. It was a complete joke when the game came out. You could tell that wasn't true by the trailers, right? People were throwing out allegations about Pokemon not being up to snuff. Like these narratives that get introduced, like they completely fall apart over time. Like just recently, you had a bunch of people trying to like create this controversy over the way like Pokemon Legends ZA looks, and then meanwhile, we get the Nintendo Switch 2 version of the game, which looks like phenomenal. So like again, the entire like fabrication that these games are getting worse, or that they're buggy, or they're not well made. It's just completely collapsed upon itself. These narratives cannot survive against the reality that people still genuinely play and enjoy Nintendo games. And you are going to see that in a big way when Nintendo Switch 2 launches on June 5th.